Hello and good evening. Tonight we are working on our app building exercise here. You'll see in our unit folder that I have provided a PDF file with the complete tutorial. Our objective, of course, is not to go through this whole thing tonight. I think that would be insane and probably impossible in the 2 hours that we have, especially now that I'm seeing that it's got 305 pages in this document, so it's highly unlikely. But this document here is really designed to kind of holistically teach you how to build an application from start to finish and also teach you about ASP.NET MVC in the process. So some of the initial portions of this document, which I'm going to pull up here, um, do contain things that we've already talked about in this class. So my intention here is not to reiterate those things. Maybe for future iterations of this class, I might. One of the reasons I selected this particular tutorial is because there are step-by-step instructions with great screenshots in it. It's also relatively recent. You know, I was always using the MVC Music Store in the past, and someday I'll be ambitious and I'll rewrite the whole thing in MVC 5. I know others have already done it, and then rewrite the tutorial to go with it. And maybe submit it up to Microsoft and maybe they'll publish it for me or something. But I really don't feel like doing all that work, so I found one, and I thought this was a nice one to work with. All right, so let's take a really quick look at the table of contents here in this document. You can see we already looked at the intro section, and part of what's happening here is they do in Chapter 1 or Section 1, however you want to refer to it, they do talk about what MVC is, where it comes from, a little bit of history, just like we did. We also will see in Section 2, which is a couple pages, what MVC is, you know, that whole concept of model view controller and how the traffic flows between the parts of the application and communicate with each other and make it a holistic thing. The next part, Section 3, talks about what they call an environment setup and what things you need to install. So if you jump to that, you can see they're installing Visual Studio 2015. When they came up with this tutorial, it was 2016, so this was kind of a new thing. And it was the 2015 community version that was the first one that Microsoft put out there for free, so it was kind of significant from that capacity. Okay, I'm going to scroll back up here to the table of contents to kind of keep us in that overview mindset. All right. So from there, then they jump into the actual tutorial of the whole thing. So I'm going to start us out basically on page 10, and from there we're going to look for all the step-by-step instructions. And my goal for you and this assignment, this first one that's going to be bundled with this, is to get you through these first 8 sections. So if we can get up through, looks like page 42, I will feel successful so far. If we happen to make some really killer progress, and I anticipate that that might be the case here tonight, we'll keep moving on and I'll record it into a separate video. But my goal tonight is to get up to that point, so we'll see if that is maybe about the right amount of ambition for getting it done. So I'm jumping over to page 10, and that's where I'd like you guys to be. So I am going to be reading from this, and as is pretty typical as I record these videos, very often this tutorial will be up on the screen, or I will pull it off to my second screen where you guys can't see it, but I will refer to page numbers. I'll move it over when I think it's important for you guys to see what I'm doing, as is pretty normal. So right now I am moving it off to the second screen. So I'm at the top of section 4, which is page 10, and I am getting ready to begin. So it does assume that we're going to be working with Visual Studio, so I'm going to go ahead and open up my Visual Studio 2017. Not too many differences between the 2015 and 17 versions, very, very similar to each other. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close my start page, folks, and I'm going to go directly to my file menu. This is step 1 on page 10, where he wants us to create a new project. Okay, of course, we're kind of used to this process here. He does want us to be under Visual C# on the web drop-down, and we are going to create an ASP.NET web application. And we know that this is the right one. because it does say MVC over here in the description area, so that's us. All right. And then we also want to make sure that we name this, and that's actually step number 4 in the directions. And what he wants us to call it, or she, I'm not sure, is MVC first app. Now, we know we've gone through this process of like where we store stuff, and I've been having issues when I use like the default directories. I don't like to do that. And I also have issues using my Google Drive file stream. Not a good mix. So I've been opting to work in my OneDrive for this. And it looks like I'm going to actually create another new folder here. And I'm just going to call it MVC. And I'm going to put a TP for TutorialsPoint because that's the company that came up with this. And I'm just going to call it sample app. That's just a folder name, mind you. And that's where I'm going to store my work. So that's where I'm selecting. All right. If you've got those steps done, go ahead and click OK. And that brings up our second dialog here. Now, this guy is taking an interesting approach, because we did MVC last time, and that you guys saw what that does. It kind of pre-builds a lot of stuff. That is not what they want us to do in this tutorial. They actually want us to choose empty. Okay. However, they do want us to click one of the boxes down here, and that is the one that says MVC. And what that does is it creates some of the common folders for us and some of the references that are really common within the application from one component to another. So make sure that you have empty selected and then MVC for folders. Right? Once you've got that out of the way, notice he's not having us do unit tests at this point. Not worried about authentication at this point. We're just going to go ahead and click OK. And of course, it's going to create some stuff for us. And it'll be a slightly different set of folders than we've seen in some of our other work in this class so far. So let that build. All right. And then, of course, if you look off to the right in the Solution Explorer here, you can see that we do have models, views, and controllers folders. We also have app start, app data, and a few other key files that are automatically created. Now on page 12, he has a graphic of what it should basically look like, just so you get familiar with it. All right. Now, we've created something that has no content, correct? But you notice in step number 6 on page 12, he's asking us to go ahead and run this, telling us in advance that we're going to run into an issue. What's the issue? There's nothing to run, right? And so we should see the internal server launch. It will attempt to run the site, or the application, if you want to think of it that way. And it should come back with a 404 error. So it says HTTP 404 means it's not found. It's not finding the root application in the folder. And that actually is exactly what we're expecting. Okay. So the first thing that we have to do in order to stop it from throwing that error each time is we're going to actually start by adding a controller. So right now we are at the very bottom of page 13, executing step number 1. Now we've done this already in this class, and we know that to add a controller we do what? We go to the controller folder, and you right-click, choose Add, and then select Controller. It's one of the default actions that happens with that particular thing. On page 14, folks, if you scroll down, you'll notice that they do a very nice job of giving you screenshots of what you should be expecting to see. And scroll down past that to step number 2, which is at the top of page 15. You'll see that they do want us to select the empty MVC controller. Okay, so go ahead and click Add, so it's the very top one. All right, and then we're going to be asked to name it. Now, you guys have already learned that whenever you're working with controllers, the word controller has to be part of it. So we're just changing the first part of it, and we're calling it home controller. Okay, and go ahead and click Add. Now that will trigger the internal scaffolding. What scaffolding does is it builds a bunch of predetermined actions depending on how we connect it to other parts of the application. In this case, it just is going to return a default home controller. So you can see it's a C# file. And you can see all the resources that are listed underneath. And basically all that's in there right now is an index action that's going to actually load up a view. All right. So what they want us to do is, in step number 4, bottom of page 15, is to actually start making a couple of changes. And they're having us look at all the libraries. So on page 15 here, as you see, they're having us look at what the system libraries are at the top. And then they're going to have us, of course, kind of the thing that we've done already, is change the return string here to just basically read a custom message, basically to show us that we're actually doing something, you know, so that what's ending up on the screen is us doing it. So we're not just going to return a view, we're actually going to return some text. So I'm going to replace this whole line here and paste in what I grabbed from the book. And boy, oh boy, it sure doesn't like that, does it? Did yours not like it either? All right, and what does the error message say? It says, represents a series of Unicode characters. Oh, it doesn't want us to do it like this. Now, I'm not sure that is necessarily a problem. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to run it, see what happens. So Control S to save. And obviously it's not going to let us proceed past this point. So now we have to figure out how to adjust it. Could I be any more silly here? Can you guys see this? See if you guys can see the difference. Do you see the difference there? See this right here? Yeah. We're not returning an action result, we're returning a string. All right, well that makes a whole lot of sense. All right, simple enough. Save your work. Go ahead and hit the launch. It's always the little things, folks, you know. And we should say voila. And there it is. Very, very, very exciting. Okay, but a successful step nonetheless, and pretty important that we clear that hurdle. All right, moving that back off to my second screen here. And so that was number 4. That was section 4, if you want to call it that. I'm not sure if we should call these chapters or sections or whatever. That was a chapter. It was very short. All right. All right. We finished section 4, chapter 4, whatever you want to call it. And I'm noticing that he's got he or she has a chapter 5 here, which talks about the MVC life cycle. These are kind of things that we have lectured on already. And I would encourage you to go through and read through this. I'm not going to lecture on it because I know you guys can read, but you can see the gist of it is to show you how an MVC application handles the information that comes in from your client or from a browser, how routing kicks in, the controller kicks in, something happens after that to basically render a view to send it back to the client. So there's a whole process that you go through. All right, that's something we already kind of learned and talked about. So we're on to section number 6 now, which is top of page 19. Now, one thing that's really important inside of MVC application, of course, is this concept of routing things to the right place. Another thing that we've kind of learned a little bit about. And there's some tasks in this section or chapter, depending on how you look at it, that we will be executing. All right. Now, interestingly, they're pointing us to look at the global ASAX file. So if you want to go ahead and open that up and take a look at the code inside there, you'll notice that inside here, they have a protected method inside the class called application start. Okay? And part of one of the first things that happens, and notice this is a protected method. It's not something that you really can access or alter necessarily. And there's certain things that happen within the application that are controlled by routes. And the routes are basically controlled, as we learned, by what you type into the URL in your browser, right? So if you start to dig in to, for example, this class file here, you would find the code that they're showing on page 20 in this document. And you can take a look at it right here. But there's the routes, and we talked about this in some of our previous lectures. The way that MVC is set up is that the URLs are actually built upon a certain structure that is predetermined. It's not like accidental. And this is very common, right, amongst all MVC applications, regardless of language or tools. So what you'll see is whatever your URL is, after that host name or machine name, whatever.com or whatever the website is, the first thing that follows the slash will be a controller call. So which controller are you bringing up? Then it might be the thing that follows that after the slash would be triggering an action or a method within that controller. And then following that is where you start to pass parameters that might control some of those methods. Notice that there's defaults also set up so that when you create a new controller, automatically it'll create like something for home with an index action that's attached to it. So you can create a controller, it automatically generates an index view. This is what he's trying to explain here. The other thing that we've also learned is that when we start to control the routes through the URL, we know that when we're working with the internal development server that you'll see this like localhost and a port number that it's kind of randomly assigned. Yours will always be different, chances are. And we've already experimented with these pieces as well, where we've seen that this portion of the URL home would indicate the home controller. This one would indicate the home controller triggering the index action. So whatever we've decided that action to be, that's what would happen. So it might just take us to a view and show us a page, but in fact it does exactly that. So if you wanted, you could relaunch your application. We've already created a home controller, right? And you could trigger those URLs. I'm not going to go through that process, but you guys have already seen that in action. Now, what's kind of interesting is that you can also go into those pages and you can actually change what the defaults are, which is kind of interesting. and really kind of gives you a lot of power. So the example that they're using here is if we went to a process controller, we can kind of map this out in our routes and then come up with actions and IDs and whatever that would fall into position here. And then you would end up with maybe a file that would look kind of like this, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, but you can force it into a route and make it happen that certain way. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to follow the steps here. So we are now on page 24, right at the top. That's shuffling off to my second screen now. And they want us to go ahead and let's go ahead and run the application. Let's just get it to launch. That's good just to get it to launch. And then they want us to actually go ahead and type after the URL a / and the word process with a capital P, which we know is going to fail. Why? Because we haven't created a damn thing for it, right? So how is that going to work? It's not going to. All right. Let's go back to our application, hit the stop button there, and now we're going to right-click on that controllers folder one more time and do an add. So we're going to choose add and go to controller. Now we're on page 25, folks. Once again, we're choosing an empty one. We're going to select add. We're going to call this process controller. Hit the add button. You're going to see it added into the controllers folder. It's all ready for editing here. And now we're going to do a little bit of edit. So we're already down to page 27. And I'm checking all the libraries that are listed to make sure they match up with what's in my file here. And this time I'm not going to miss the fact that they're not returning an action result, that they're returning a string. And we're going to change this to a string right here. And it's going to say this is the process page, which is not a bad habit to get into, just to make sure that your stuff is just actually loading. Other thing that we're going to do, and see I'm missing it again, is we're actually going to change the word index to list. All right? And we're going to save this, and we're going to go ahead and hit that run button. And we're going to let it load up. So by default, it's going to load the home controller, right? And now we're going to append to the end of the URL. We're going to add process. Just add process and press enter. It's not going to work. If this was named index, guess what? It would. But in order to trigger this, because this is named list, yeah, you guys are figuring it out now, we have to append to the end of it, so the process controller and the list method, and now it brings it up. So you see how that triggers. So I think that's a nice little example of how the routing works. Right now we're up to section number 7, folks. So we're on page 28. And right away, we're jumping into Visual Studio. I'm noticing here at the top of section 7 that we're actually going to be creating a new project. You guys seeing that? So I'm going to err on the safe side here, and I'm going to close the one I currently have open. So I'm going to close my solution. Got it all saved. And then I'm just going to follow the instructions provided. So step 1, top of page 28, says go to File, New, Project. We still want to be in Web. Make sure we're choosing C#, Web. And then we want to choose ASP.NET Web Application, which is the one that we're currently on right now. And that's the one with the .NET framework. I am seeing, I'm going to tell you what, I'm seeing a lot out there. See, this is Visual Studio 17. And I'm noticing that Microsoft is pushing really hard and heavy out in the marketplace, that people start switching over to doing the core stuff. So it's something I need to explore myself before I get into the point of teaching it. But if you're familiar with like Visual Studio 2017, now that you can actually load that up on a Mac, the core libraries are the ones that end up on a Mac. So it really behooves me to check that out, because I think going forward into the future, Microsoft's really kind of planning to be a multi-platform kind of development company. I think that's going to be really useful for the students. So, you know, that's just something to keep in the back of your head. All right, so we got that chosen. They do want us to name this, and the name that they're giving it is MVC Controller Demo. And then I'm noticing that they probably want another folder now, so you know what? Actually, I'm going to put it in the same folder with the other one. I'm okay with that. Really what's happening is it's going to create a separate solution file and a separate folder inside of it, so it'll be okay. So MVC Controller Demo. All right. Once again, click OK once you're all set. They want us to stick with empty, and they want us to put a checkbox in for MVC. All right, go ahead and click OK, folks. Same deal as last time. Empty application, nothing yet to run. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to follow the same actions we did before. So we're going to go to the controllers folder. We're going to right click. We're going to add a controller. They want us to choose an empty one. So go ahead and click add. They want us to name it employee. Spell it correctly though. Employee controller. Then go ahead and click your add button. All right. So the point here is now we're going to go ahead and mess with the routes a little bit. So the way we're going to mess with the routes is we're going to jump over to the routes config file. And you see that's not in the root anywhere. That's actually in the app start folder. So if you go to the app start folder and expand it, now you can see the route config file. And what it wants us to do is add the route that's shown at the bottom of page 31. And they want us to add that to what's already there. So you'll see some stuff that looks familiar. So grab the code at the bottom of page 31. You can grab it right from the box if you're working from the PDF, depending on what PDF tool you're using. And where they want us to put it is kind of in between ignore route and map route. So like right in between these two. So I'm going to add a couple blank lines there and just paste it in. Paste it in just fine. I'm not getting any underlines or anything. All right. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is that the way that we're mapping this is they're going to have a route set up so that if we type /employee after our machine name, then we can also add a slash and throw in somebody's name. And there's a difference here in that normally it's controller and then action. But we're kind of skipping the action thing here because we're setting up a custom route. And it's kind of bypassing that. And you can kind of do that if you know how to tweak the routes like this. All right. So the way that we will work around this, and it's not really a problem, I guess, because it's being done by design, is we're going to change some stuff in the employee controller class. So go back to that one. And then we have an action result that we're going to add in here. So we're going to get rid of the index method. And then over here in my PDFs, just so you can see what I'm doing, I'm grabbing this code. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to use that to just replace the index method because that doesn't exist in the finished version that they're working on. And then notice that, of course, the formatting isn't as pretty, so I'm going to make it prettier. So all the carriage returns are not following. And if you don't like the way it lays, I mean, you can lay it out any way you want. I mean, that's probably the more formal way to do it in terms of layout. Remember, you can always like highlight the code, right-click, and format, and it'll do it automatically for you if you don't want to do it manually. All right. Now let's talk about what's actually happening behind the scenes here. This is kind of interesting because we are triggering an action result and we're triggering a search. So when we are going to be calling the employee controller with a / and a person's name, it automatically will send that name to the only method that exists here, which is the search method. And then it'll run a search. It's going to grab the name, it's going to store it in a variable called input, and then it's going to return. What is it going to return? Well, whatever we tell it to return, but in this case it looks like it's going to return the input, according to what I see on the screen there. It's not really that complicated, actually. So now let's go ahead, hit a save all, and hit the run button, get it up in your browser, and then we'll manually type in a URL here. Now keep in mind, unlike the other application, did we set up a home controller here? No. Is this a reason to panic? No, it's not, because we didn't tell it to do anything on default, did we? We didn't. So what we're going to add now is just a /, but we are going to type in employee / type in your name. So now what's happening here is we're actually passing the name through the URL to the application. The application is grabbing it and sending it right back to us. Okay, not a really fancy example, but it shows you how powerful that routing stuff is and how you can actually go in there and tweak it and customize what's being sent around. And I think that is pretty cool. Now remember, as you guys are listening to the video here and you're basically doing homework in the process, don't forget to grab your screenshots at key points in time. So this might be a screenshot right here. Something like this. Grab the whole screen. All right, so I'm going to stop that and move on. All right, folks, we are now making it up to section number 8, which is as far as I hope to get tonight, and we're not even halfway through class yet, so I think we're doing pretty good on time. So I think we're gonna plow through as far as we can, which I think will be helpful. All right. In section 8, he starts talking about actions, and really what he's referring to in this regard is what we call action methods. So now I know we've talked about this stuff a little bit via lectures and demonstration, and I know that you guys understand it on a basic level, but what happens with an MVC application like this is we do read that URL a little bit differently than we do in a traditional HTML format where it's folder and file structure on the server relative to your hosting account. Here instead it's application based. It's based on the routing table, it's based on the controller, it's based on the methods inside those controllers and how it's all that kind of moved around within the application. So what happens, internally is it gets read. We look at the routing. There's no routing set up. Then we look at the controller, and then depending on what the controller does, it'll pop out some sort of result for us. All right. And he's got a little chart here that kind of walks you through that process. Please take the time to read that and try to understand it. Now, the kind of things that you can do in terms of actions as a result of your code fall into a few different categories here. So you can see some of the results. Now I know that the other book talks about this as well. This seems to be a little bit more concise listing. So the thing that we just did was we returned content, right? You guys remember that? So we called upon a method called content, and we put a variable inside there, and it just put it back up on the screen because that's what it does. It just returns a string. But you can see that you can do things with files, with JavaScript and JSON, handling different URLs, redirecting to different places, or generating different views or partial views of pages, right? And these are all things that we've kind of looked at already. All right. So now he's asking us to look at an example from the previous chapter where we set up this employee thing that we just did, right? Where we grab that URL and it actually goes into a search string, gets stored in a variable, and then we just put it back up on the screen, right? So he has you kind of do that process again. You want to run it again? Go for it. But let's take it up a notch now and get to the point where we're adding a controller. So let's go ahead and go back to that controllers folder and do a right click and do an add a controller. As is the process they're seeming to follow here, they want you to keep choosing the empty one. So go ahead and click add. This one should be called customer controller. Click add. We are now down at page 40. And I don't think he's having us change anything in the customer controller at this point. It's just returning a view. And then on page 40, he wants us to add one more controller. So let's right click, add another controller. Once again, empty. This one will be the home controller. When that launches, we're going to do a couple little tweaks here, just like we did before. We're going to change it from an action result to a string, and then we're going to drop in a string right here, just so we know that what we're dealing with. This is the home controller. I'll be obnoxious and make it all caps. Close those double quotes. Go ahead, hit save all. Hit your run button there. Let's see that load up. So now at least just from launching the application, and I mean, you guys are seeing the pattern here, right? We have a home controller, so when it launches, by default it goes to index, home controller, loads up this simple little thing that we just created. All right. At the very bottom of page 40, he wants us to go to the customer controller, so I'm going to bring that one back up on the screen. And he wants us to add the following code to it. So this is actually split over page 40 and 41. And I can't really select across pages without getting page numbers and stuff coming with. So it's going to be pasting in like 2 steps here. So we're going to get this part in there, and now I'm on page 41 to grab the rest. And you see what I'm returning is basically what? Some straight up HTML? You guys catching that? And here's where we want to use the tools to help us format. if it lets me. Okay, so it's not formatting it, so I'm going to have to like clean it up manually here, which is a little cumbersome. But it falls into that category of first world problems, folks. Oh my God, I got to edit my electronic document using high-end tools. What a pain. You're supposed to kind of find that amusing, I hope. To varying degrees, I suppose. However you want to format it, just as long as you see that. Basically, what are you returning at this point? It's straight up HTML. You notice the @ sign in there? You guys remember what the @ sign is indicative of? Razor, right. They're not really talking about Razor very much or at all yet. Now, I want you to be really careful going in here before we run this. We know that we're running the customer controller. So the first part of the URL is going to be whatever the machine name is /customer. And then what to get this list? Get all customers. So let's go ahead and run it. And we'll type exactly that in. All right, so our home controller is launched. Let's put in customer and then get all customers. It's got to be in the right case, folks. And what does it pull back? Our unordered list. Right? All right, pretty simple, but at the same time kind of a powerful little example. All right. The next thing that he's trying to point out here, bottom of page 41, is you can also allow your application to do redirects for a controller to a different controller. And what he's going to use here as an example is we're going to redirect from the home controller to the customer controller by changing the code in the home controller to allow us to do that. So here's how we're going to accomplish that. Let's go ahead and stop the application. And now we're going to jump over to our home controller. So if you don't have that one open, open it. Otherwise, switch over to it. And we're going to change that index method now so it doesn't just return a string. We're just going to replace it, and we're going to replace it with this. And I'm going to clean up the code, so don't worry about that. But we are going to do a return statement here. And what are we returning? It? So the method that we're running is called redirect to action. And notice it's kind of like the reversal of the order here. How first we're calling the action, and then we're calling the controller, because that's the order the parameters are passed here. So you can kind of anticipate what that's going to do. Let's go ahead and save this and just run the application. Now you'll notice that as soon as we run it, I'm not going to say it first, let it happen first. As soon as we run it, it hits the home page. The home page redirects it to that particular action and that particular controller. That's a pretty powerful little thing too. It's kind of cool. Okay, folks, that completes what I had hoped that we would accomplish in that first little assignment. Okay, so I'm going to actually cap the video here. We're going to take a break in class, and I think we're going to press on when we come back. We're going to do some more of this, okay, because I think that so far it's been pretty informative. So I will see you in part 2.